to read the.
Oop.
Oh, maybe that's the right spot to read a little bit of that chapter, and then I can say a little bit more about it. Forgive me, I've got so many markers in the book that I'm having a bit of trouble finding the right one. Okay, this is from a chapter called "The Maps." The maps here are useless. In Jerusalem, and I should say this is very much weaving my own experience of walking through Jerusalem with the memories which are gifted to me by my aunt and uncle. In Jerusalem, I walk a city demarked by old and new, not east and west, when I am walking our history, and I walk to the rebuilt King David Hotel and the YMCA building opposite. And I am reminded of a story from when the infamous bombing occurs, and I have seen an image of the explosion that resembles a mushroom cloud, which is held in the Imperial War Museum collection in that now faded metropole, London. What I hear is that on the day of the explosion, Juju and Tony are sent home from school early, and they are neither adults but also not children, and they make their way together over and through the crime scene, which is as Jerusalem appears on July 22 of that year. Tony tells a story that on the corner beside the King David was a boy who the schools did not require. And during the day, all day, every day, he would go to this corner and set up a game of marbles. And as Tony tells the story, the boy is here again on this July day of 1946, playing marbles before the explosion, and he is one of the casualties after it. And as Tony and Juju pass by, what they see is a corpse blown to pieces, his skull literally open on the pavement. Tony says he recalls that some of the marbles had rolled into the boy's exposed brains, and the force of the bomb was so great that when they walk past, the marbles are still moving inside the skull of a boy who was remembered by Jerusalemites everywhere. When Tony tells this story, Juju says, I must have seen it too, but now I don't remember. And later again, when I ask Juju what happened, she says she was at home on the balcony at Asser Street eating grapes, and what she saw was the plumes of smoke that hung on the skyline for hours. This story places my uncle and aunt in the landscape of a particular day that is an important catalyst to the unfolding national trauma to follow. And when I return from Jerusalem, I recount it to Ahmed on his Flinders Lane balcony, and he stops me halfway and says, I know that story too. My aunt was there and she saw it. And I store these anatomical details of the boy and the marbles into myself and recount them on the hotel pavement to my Hebrew translator. And later in the Liberty Bell Park, I will say, this city is alive with stories that only we know, appalled by the hubris of colonial ignorance that can swallow a city without even seeing it. Maybe I'll leave it there. Sorry.
Oh, such a beautiful excerpt.
Mm.
Not the most tender passage of the book, but I think a very powerful one.
It's interesting too. Later on, I was telling a cousin of mine, she'd read the book And I was telling her about the sort of editing of it because her father was my Uncle Tony, and he was a doctor. And I think it's perhaps why he remembered so well what had happened on that particular day, this sort of real scientific precision to the scene that they'd walked through. And Juju has since offered a number of different stories, but never the story that she walked past the King David since her brother died. And she's in her 90s now, and fair enough. But what she was most insistent on other retellings of the story was that she was sitting on the balcony at our home eating grapes. And she was so insistent about the grapes, which I didn't originally think was a very important detail, that I ended up writing it in very late, very in a very, late draft. And so I was telling my cousin about this, and she said to me, "Oh yeah," she said, "but obviously the grapes are the marbles."
Ah,
And and that this is how she's remembered it. I mean, I think what was really important in writing it in a way was the multiplicity of the value of memory, not just the accurate parts of the past, but also how a person is struck by the past in the present
mm,
in that kind of Alessandro Portelli way of, when people tell you about the past, what they're actually telling you about is what matters to them, the significance of what happened, maybe how it made them feel. And if you want some statistical, analytical list of what happened, that's entirely different from the question of storytelling and memory. Um, and so I think in a way that story is one of the moments in the book that brings out those stories. I mean, I think the other thing about stories of this nature, and as you say, Sarah, it's corroborated by, I was quite astonished when it was corroborated by another friend as I started to tell him the story. And he'd heard it. And of course, at least in English, and I've done a little bit of historical research work on the bombing of the King David Hotel, I've never found a reference to that boy. Um,
I mean, I
and
think
yet,
there's also such beauty in these stories meeting up
mm,
again so far away and transmitted through such different lines as well.
mm, that's absolutely right. There's something really quite special about those meetings. I mean, there's a very tiny moment in the book, Sari, actually, and you, as you have often done in my life, in a way initiated it, which is that some years ago now I met Issam Nasser, who you had informed me was somehow connected to the Sahars. But after we met, I went home and had a look at a family tree that my aunt had created. And I emailed him because he didn't know very much about our family because his grandfather had died when he was quite young. And anyway, I said, "Look, there's a family tree. Your mother's on it. She was obviously a cousin, but everything else seems to be wrong." And instead of his surname, there was a different name. And I told him what it was. And he said, "Oh, well, it's not our surname, but it's the village my father's from." And so we sort of ascertained that the tree was quite accurate. And he learned about some aunts, actually, that he didn't know he'd had from an earlier marriage of his father's. And that wife had died sort of much earlier. And, so this amazing, we met in Doha and have been separated all our lives, and yet my grandmother and his mother were, very close first cousins. It's some of that, yeah. I mean, it's remarkable to find people when you do. I think you're right.
Interwoven webs.
And much as we found each other, Sari,
Indeed, indeed.
and some years into our friendship that Sari was my cousin,
Cousin, yes, indeed.
which was happy news.
It was, it was. I think everybody guessed before we did. So, Michaela, of touched on this a little bit already, but I wanted
Mm.
to ask you about your approach because, you know, many people would have chosen to do this in a more sort of academic or historical way, but you've really chosen to do something with all of these really beautiful personal textures while also being very, very attentive to historical detail. Could you
Mm.
tell us a little bit about, you know, the decisions around that and, you know, how you were sort of, you know, conceiving of sort of this project, particularly in this sort of shift from an encyclopedia to you know to what is the you know this beautiful final product.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, in a way, any project is sort of informed by what's going on around you at the time. And I started writing the book at a certain point during COVID, which at least where I was, we had very long lockdowns. Um, and during that time, I was doing a lot of teaching online, and I liked teaching quite a lot, but I really disliked teaching online. It was quite joyless, and
Yeah, I was thankfully spent that.
yeah, and I was also finishing up some scholarly articles and not feeling very passionate about those articles at that moment either. Everything felt like quite a slog, and I remember asking myself, you know, well, what would you like to do? What actually makes you feel happy? Because in a way, there was quite a lot of time of a sort, you know, during the lockdowns of the pandemic. And so it was a good moment to ask questions of that nature. And I thought I had trained actually as a creative writer, but I had really stopped writing. I mean, probably around the time we met a long time ago, Sari, because at least at that time, I couldn't really, I had a lot of encouragement from other writers, and my work would be, you know, chosen for master classes and this sort of thing amongst people who were quite a bit more advanced than I was. And so I knew writers saw something in the work, but I couldn't find anyone to publish it. And I would get all these slips, you know, back in the days of the self-addressed, self-stamped envelopes with all sorts of handwritten apologies about why people couldn't publish my work. And it became very clear that this was really a political position and not really about whether or not I could write or not. And so I think that was one of the sort of catalysts to going back to a kind of creative mode of writing this work. But also there was a little bit of a shift. I could see a shift occurring with other writers. A year before I got a grant to develop this book, another really wonderful young Palestinian poet, Hasib Harani, got the same grant, and it was really after he got that that I thought, oh wow, you know, the landscape has changed a lot since I was a young creative writing student, and they're actually interested in giving Palestinian writers, you know, funding for this kind of thing. But also, I suddenly got a few commissions. This, by the way, was before the 2021 Unity Intifada, so it wasn't necessarily that people were looking at Palestine. I think it was just the good fortune of a few things happening at the same time. So I had a few creative writing commissions that sort of made me feel a little bit differently about what the opportunities might be for a person who has always written about Palestine through whatever form that's been, whether that's in a kind of creative mode or whether that's in a more scholarly mode. So I think all those things sort of converged to make this project feel possible. Like there might be someone for somewhere for it to go if I did it. And I probably hadn't felt that before. I think the creative element was also, I mean, a little bit contingent on COVID and the fact that at a certain point when I understood that I had a book that I was writing and not maybe an essay or a collection of essays, um, I would read I would read each finished chapter, or we would call them entries, to my father. on the phone, and Dad doesn't much like to speak on the phone. So reading him a chapter was a really nice way of sort of having time together on the phone without really needing to hold a conversation. But he was most enlivened by those sorts of interactions. So he would think about the chapters and he would call me back or send me texts about things that he'd thought about that might relate to things that I was thinking about or writing about as an exchange. And so I suppose the register of multiplicity or the register of polyphony of collective voices in a way reflected the collectivity of, this phone exchange that my father and I had as I was writing. Um, and maybe, I mean, I think there's a sense in which storytelling and, histories of or oral storytelling traditions are important in our region, in our part of the world, in a way that is maybe not so much the case here where we are, at least not to a sort of settler culture. Um, and maybe everyone grows up like this, but there was also a sense for me at a particular moment of playing with the gaps and absences of the past. And I don't think that a scholarly work would have been able to tolerate the the absence in the way that the decision to write in a creative way could tolerate some of those absences, and also the foregrounding of those absences as something worth knowing, as something poetic and painful and really beautiful, and maybe as signs of grief, but also as signs of tenacity, that even in those gaps and absences, people sort of press on, um, trying to obtain their stories, trying to narrate their stories, trying to create senses of self and belonging and place and history and past and future too, I suppose, in a way. And so that creative mode really seemed to offer opportunities that, one imagines that, the second referee would not have accepted even if the first one had in in the scholarly idiom.
Indeed, indeed. I wanted to ask you because the book's been out for a year or so now, and you've won the
Mm.
Victorian Premier's Literary Prize for nonfiction and been longlisted and shortlisted, and I mean, there's been an amazing reception to this book.
Mm.
How are you feeling about it being in the world and the ways in which, how are you finding people are connecting with it?
Yeah, it's been, you can't, I wasn't, I wasn't properly prepared, and I suppose no one is, for what it would mean to have a book out in the world, as a first book, and maybe even more so as a person who doesn't cultivate a social media profile. So there's a certain quietness and smallness to the way that I interact with people in the world. Um, and actually, we're almost at the anniversary of the launch, which was on Nakba Eve last year. So it's exactly a week from now, and it's been out for uh, 12 months and 1 week as of this evening, I think. Um, I mean, the book is dedicated to Palestinians everywhere, um, especially my dear dad. I think that's the language of the dedication. And I've been amazed by the number of Palestinian people that I don't know who have found the book and who have read the book and who have felt so moved by the book that they've managed to find my work email, which I guess is not so difficult when you work at a public university, and engage in, multi-email exchanges about what it meant for them to see themselves written into a book. And I think that was precisely why I wrote it. I wanted the Palestinian diaspora to see itself, themselves, ourselves in a literary context, not just as a I suppose, research project, but actually as part of a literary body. And I think that's been some of the most humbling interactions that I've had with people. I've had people send me a series of um, their own family photographs, beautiful studio portraits, photographs with little white borders. It's almost like people look at the selection of photos in the book and then send me a similar, like a mirroring selection of photos that they might have from their family collection. And, you know, the stories are quite varied and often quite painful, but also really treasured and quite beautiful. Um, and I suppose it's very honoring. I actually don't ever remember looking someone's email up and emailing them after reading their book. So I'm actually very moved that that's what some people do. Maybe I should do it myself when I'm sort of really affected by a book. But then there have been groups that have really surprised me. I've been to a few events where um, there've been large diaspora but not Palestinian communities there who have been really moved by the work or really connected with the work. Actually, a former colleague of mine from a totally different diaspora whose father had died not long before he read the book. Um, was telling me with tears in his eyes that he actually just saw it as a book, a sort of a book about diasporas and the relationship that diaspora kids have with their dads, and that had sort of brought his dad back for him in reading the book. So I think that's been quite interesting, the way in which and actually, it's made me honor a broader sense of diasporas in return, and thinking about, well, what can the book do? What can the book do in the world? The book has made more than my own diaspora feel seen, so I have to honor that. Um, I think people have seen. I think one of the reasons why it's appealed to people from other diasporas is that they can see in it techniques that they can use actually to research their own stories, but also as a methodology for thinking about how do you deal with what you don't know? How do you deal with
Mm.
the absences? How do you deal with the fact that the person you wish you could have asked died 10 years before you were born, you know? And so um, that's been a very moving thing. I think it's been quite seen also by the poets. And I actually come from a poetry background, and I feel most honored by that. I find poetry to be such a precise art. To have poets kind of see that precision in this book is also a beautiful thing.
I think there's a sort of a balance between delicate and assertive insistence actually on rejecting absence in some ways, you know. I
Mm,
mean, there are absences there and there are things that you will never know. But
mm,
actually, there's also such an abrogation through all of this beautiful interweaving of different narratives together into this
mm,
one beautiful thing.
mm.
I'm a little conscious of the time. Do we have any, shall we open up for questions?
We've
Does
Sure.
anybody have any questions?
got about 15 minutes, so
Oh,
perhaps
15? Yeah.
so up to you, Sari. Perhaps if you'd like to open up for questions, now might be a good time.
Does anybody in the audience have any questions that they would like to ask?
Could I perhaps ask the first question if that's okay? I don't see any hands up yet.
Please.
Um, Thank you, Michaela, for sharing that beautiful experience. And I haven't had the opportunity to read the book yet, but certainly look forward to it. I wondered if you could share a bit more about the political silencing that you mentioned. in terms of Palestine? Have you spoken to other artists and writers who've also experienced that? And how were you able to overcome that in finally persisting to have this book published?
Oh, thanks, John. I mean, it's a complicated question and it runs over many decades, and I'm certainly not the only person who's experienced the censorship of writing about something that's sort of beyond anything anyone's willing to publish. I think for me, uh, I was a really enthusiastic young writer, but at a certain point, I felt for a number of reasons. I mean, I had a law degree and I had a history degree as well as a creative writing degree. I felt like I needed to do a doctorate, which I did in representations of narrative and of Palestinian narrative in Western media places because I felt like I needed the sort of the weight of the institutional sort of imprimatur of the doctorate to allow me to talk about the things that I wanted to talk about. In terms of coming back to writing, I think I think it's been decades of work that I and Sari and other people, maybe people here, I can see Bassam's here, and I know he's put in the work too, um, have put into insisting that there's nothing inherently controversial about talking about people's rights. Had we got further, we wouldn't be watching a genocide, of the last 3 years on that front. Um, but there's an organisation at the moment called Readers and Writers Against the Genocide, and I've thought very hard about whether or not it would be okay for me to wear that t-shirt in kind of employment spaces. And I thought, it would be quite strange that someone would want to run an argument that being anti-genocide is an inherently problematic position to take up. And so I think maybe that's okay. Um, but look, of course, I write a bit about censorship. It's hard to say in a nutshell. There have obviously been many issues of censorship, but I think the thing is you don't know in the case of Palestinian people who and how many people have been censored. It's impossible to know. Some people are represented vociferously claiming that they've been silenced, but that is not the Palestinian community who find themselves in that boat. Actually, I mean, if you look at something like the Adelaide Writers Festival, which obviously collapsed under the poor decision making of Peter Malinauskas and the Adelaide Festival board, as it subsequently turned out when more information came to light. But I went over to Adelaide for the alternative replacement events, and Louise Adler gave an address where she said, Palestinian people are rarely included in public conversation and in the programming for the Adelaide Writers Festival, which had collapsed. She'd invited three Palestinian people, myself, Randa Abdul Fattah, and a really terrific Jerusalemite poet, Najwan Darwish. And by contrast, she'd invited 12 Jewish speakers, and yet three Palestinian speakers was too much. Um, so I suppose these questions of, voice and representation are things that we still need to um, be mindful of and push for better than we have now. I mean, we're in the middle of in the middle, who knows where we are in the continuum of it, but we're in the middle of so many alarming repressive developments across media, across universities. I think at the moment, maybe what's changed is that these things are more visible than they used to be. I think that might be the main uh, good news aspect of it, which is pretty modest news. What do you think, Sari?
I mean, I think on the one hand, we are seeing an opening up of spaces, but we're also seeing in equal measure a closing down of spaces. And this is a kind of a very contradictory thing, which makes it very I mean, I think it's reflective of a lot of polarization in the current moment. On the one hand, we are seeing this showcasing of Palestinian literature, art, culture, Arab literature, art, culture more generally. But we're also seeing pushbacks against that. And I think, there are these two opposing forces which are very complicated.
Mm,
I mean, for those who follow contemporary art, I think seeing what happened to Khaled Sabsabi's exhibition was at the Venice Biennale, being cancelled 6 days after it was announced, and then eventually, after much public pressure, being reinstated. The Biennale is opening at the moment and is also kind of coming under pressure, given the politics of the Biennale itself at the moment. The judges for the Biennale said that they would not judge work by either Russia or Israel, and then several days later were stood down. And currently, as the Biennale is opening as we speak, there are a whole series of protests that are ensuing. So I think in many ways there is a sort of quite a there's a battle going on in this civic sphere for what that civic sphere looks like. And I think
mm,
this makes it makes it a very difficult time to be operating in the cultural spheres in this way.
mm.
We have,
Although there's another thing to be said there, which is that for many people who operate in cultural spheres, it's not the work itself that creates the means by which a person lives. Most people have other jobs. And so, I mean, again, to go back to the Adelaide Writers Festival, there's no particular loss financially in saying you won't go to a festival. There is a loss in connecting with audiences, having the opportunity to talk about your book, maybe selling, a handful of copies or maybe even 50 or 100. But at the end of the day, it's not a huge amount if the trade-off is losing your independence of thought and your ethics and your principles, which are probably very integrated in the way that you do your work. Yeah.
we
Um,
have a question
yes,
here.
I was about to say. Go ahead, John.
Just a question from Fiona who asks, who says she hasn't read your book, but wanted to know what the relevance of the word Christian has in your book or or in this presentation to this group.
Oh. Well, I suppose, I'm a Christian Palestinian person, and I suppose to me that marker is quite important in understanding uh, I always hesitate to call it a conflict in understanding the occupation under which Palestinian people live vis-a-vis Israel. I think understanding that there's a diversity of Palestinian life, Muslim, Christian, Druze, and a range of Christian uh, denominations as well is just an important aspect of the diversity of Palestinian life. And also, it's a minority, but actually not not well. It it constituted a large part of the diaspora. So, in writing a diaspora story, I think that the early movements from urban areas of Christian people was quite a vast amount, and the numbers of Christians in Jerusalem, where my family are from, for example, is much, much smaller today than it was, even just proportionally. Yeah. So I think that is an important thing. I can't speak for the PCIA as to why they invited me along, but I thank them for the invitation.
I think there is also, for those who are less familiar with Palestinian culture, there that I think most Palestinians would see themselves as Palestinian first, and then of whatever religion or region they come from.
Mm,
But I think there is a sort of a particular social texture to the book that speaks very much to urban Christian circles and urban Christian life and certain modes of being. And I think these are also, as we saw over the course of Easter, where the
Mm.
Church of the Holy Sepulchre was shut down by the Israelis, also a sort of a sense of breaking of these Christian traditions. Though I would say that they are more of a texture for the book rather than a focus of it, if I may.
I mean, I met recently Mother Agapia, who's quite a powerful, or has been quite a powerful advocate in the States in particular. Originally a Greek Orthodox nun, but she's still part of the Orthodoxy, but I think has possibly shifted across orders. And I mean, she does a wonderful job of highlighting, and I think it's a very powerful thing to highlight that the violence of the Israeli state is not reserved for Muslim people. It's everyone. It's all the Christian Arabs as well. It's the Druze. It's everyone else who's there. In fact, I did an event recently in person, and an older Italian lady introduced herself to me, but actually her family had lived in Bethlehem. Her mother, like my grandmother, had been born in Bethlehem and then they'd lived in Jerusalem. And she also had a story of Exodus. I mean, there were many people displaced from Palestinian who were not necessarily Palestinian Arabs, but they lived there for some reason for several generations. But they too were displaced. But they were not spared. No one was spared. Um,
Do we have any other questions from people in the audience? Ah, we do. What was the most surprising or unexpected discovery you made about your family while writing the book, and why Jaffagate?
ah, Thank you for that question. They're quite different answers. The Jaffa Gate, actually, because my grandfather was a tourist guide, amongst other things, and it was around the Jaffa Gate that all the tourism businesses, Thomas Cook and others, were housed, and where he also had his initial offices. It's where my great grandfather had a cafe by the Jaffa Gate, and so I guess there was a sense that location was a really meaningful one, both to the sort of constellation of assemblies in the book and also as actually a really important landmark, I suppose, to Jerusalemite Palestinian people, including depending on when you take a photograph of the place, the clock tower that I know Sarah's been doing work on, and I believe the components were stripped and taken back to London to use in the Big Ben.
No,
Um,
destroyed. Yeah, yes, it was moved to another location, to ironically Allenby Square for a few years
right.
off the Jaffa Gate, but it had been a symbol of like Jerusalemite civil pride built to commemorate the Jubilee of Sultan Abdulhamid II. But yes, the British removed it pretty quickly once they took control of the city.
Did the clock part go back to the UK or go to the UK? No,
No,
that's
no,
a myth,
no.
an
Yeah.
urban myth.
Mm.
Um, in terms of the most surprising discovery, and it's sort of a long story, but I'll try and give you a quick version. Um, my family left Jerusalem in 1948, quite specifically because in late 1947, when the partition plan was announced, which obviously resulted in, fighting on the Palestinian side, against sort of Zionist settlerism and terrorism, there was no room in the hospitals. The hospitals were really full throughout Jerusalem, and my grandmother was about to give birth to my father. And 10 days before he was born, there was a bombing, the bombing of the Semiramis Hotel in Katamon, which was a neighborhood or a suburb over from where my family lived. And it was very, um, really a turning point for a lot of West Jerusalemite Palestinian families in deciding whether or not they would leave the area or not. The thing is, I'd grown up hearing the story that it was really because of my father that my family had left Jerusalem. And when I was thinking about the dates and writing this book and dwelling in those dates in a really different way to the way that you accept family narrative, which you don't really interrogate for its logic, I suddenly realized that they'd left Jerusalem because of that bombing. And I called my aunt and spoke to her about it. And she told me the story about it, which is in the book towards the end. But then after she and I had that conversation, she called my father to talk about the bombing of the Semiramis Hotel. And then he called me. And he said to me, my sister just called and she said it was really lucky that I needed to be born. And I realized that he carried the guilt of his family's departure from Jerusalem until he was about 72 years old. And so it was when I was drafting the book that he had this conversation with his sister, who expressed relief rather than sort of sorrow or regret or grief about his sort of birth, that he'd been able to put that burden down, perhaps. But that's the quick version of the story.
Thank you for sharing that very, very beautiful, beautiful story.
Mm.
Michaela,
Um,
thank you so much for this wonderful evening. And Michaela, for your generous sharing and for your excellent writing. I mean, I know there'll be many people on the call who will be looking forward, like I am, to purchasing your book. So we'll be sure to share information about how to do that in a thank you email, a follow-up email to everyone. But perhaps just before you do, any last words from you, Sari or Michaela?
just a very quick thank you to Michaela for being so generous with her words and her time this evening.
And my big thanks to you, Sari, for doing the hard work of moderating, which always stresses me out no end. And thank you so much to people from logging in from all around the country and also writing what country you're on. It's actually really beautiful to see that. I should do it. Yeah. And thank you to PCIA for having us.
Thank you. It's our pleasure, and we'll be sure to share details of where you can buy a copy of Michaela's book. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michaela.